In the spring of 2009, a regional sales director from the Harmon Basin Ironworks drove a company pickup down the two-track lane that bordered Cass Hewitt's property in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, stopped at the gate, and told Cass that they were going to start depositing iron filings along the fence line. The material came out of their grinding operation. It was inert, the director said, harmless grit. They had nowhere else to put it. He was not asking. He had already spoken with the county waste coordinator. The paperwork was filed. He handed Cass a one-page summary from a licensed engineer that described the material as non-hazardous industrial byproduct, leaned against the hood of the truck, and waited. Cass took the paper. He read it twice. He said, "All right." The director said that the company would be grateful. He said that Cass was doing the community a service. By 2021, Cass Hewitt had accumulated more than 40 tons of iron oxide-rich material along that fence line, had built a small processing shed behind his barn, and was selling hand-milled natural iron pigment to artists, architectural restorers, and paint formulators in 12 states. His most popular shade, a deep warm ochre he called Harmon Gate, was carried by 2 regional art supply distributors and had sold 4,000 units in the calendar year prior. The director who first drove down that lane had called again too, but not to negotiate a dumping arrangement. He called because the company's environmental consultant had seen the Pigment line at a restoration trade show in Pittsburgh and asked where the material came from. He asked, very carefully, whether Cass would be interested in a formal supply agreement. Cass said he would think about it. This is the story of what happened in the 12 years between those two conversations, and why the answer to that question turned out to matter far more than anyone who drove down that lane in 2009 could possibly have understood. Cass Hewitt was 61 years old in 2009, and he was known in Allegheny County for 2 things: the patience of a man who could repair anything once, and the stubbornness of one who would not repair it twice the same wrong way. He had farmed 83 acres in the Yoyogini River Valley for most of his adult life, running a small beef herd and a market garden alongside it, but the deeper thing he had always been, the thing his father had made him before the farm, was a colorist. That word sounds larger than what it meant on his property. What it meant was that Cass made paint. He had done it since his mid-20s. Not house paint, not commercial latex. He ground mineral pigments by hand, mixed them into linseed and walnut oil, and sold them in small batches to painters and craftspeople who needed colors that commercial suppliers had stopped making. He worked from a battered ledger his father had kept, a record of sources and formulas going back to the late 1960s, when his father had learned the craft from a retired fresco restorer who had settled in the valley after the war. The fresco restorer's name was Vito Anselmi, and he had come to western Pennsylvania after spending 20 years working on historical buildings in northern Italy, and had arrived in the valley apparently finished with cities and with restoration work in equal measure. He bought a small property outside of town and made his own paint and sold it to painters in Pittsburgh who knew his name and drove out to get it. He was in his late 60s when Cass's father found him, and he taught with the completeness of a man passing something forward because he did not want it to disappear. The father spent 3 winters learning from him. When Vito died in 1975, he left the father a notebook of his own, which sat alongside the ledger and was consulted more than it was read. Cass had grown up watching his father grind pigment. He had done it himself the first time at the age of 12, turning the hand mill for an hour while his father watched and corrected his pressure and pace with the specificity of someone who understood that the wrong mill speed changed the particle distribution, and the particle distribution changed the color. He knew by the time he was 15 that a pigment that looked correct on the glass plate would read differently in a gallery room where the light came from a north-facing window. He knew that linseed oil yellows over decades and walnut oil does not. He knew the difference between surface luminosity and optical depth in a way that could not be reduced to a formula, only learned through looking at things in many kinds of light over many years. The operation was small by every reasonable measure. It was a sideline. Barely. It did not have a name until 2014. It did not have a website until 2016. What it had was a methodology, and that methodology had been built over decades, and it was exactly the kind of thing that a reasonable professional from outside that valley would look at and call a hobby. Cass did not argue the point. He was not a man who argued points. Let me tell you about iron oxide pigment, because without understanding it, none of what happened next will make the sense it should. Iron oxide is one of the oldest pigments in human hands. Ochre, sienna, umber, Venetian red, Mars yellow, Mars black, English red. The color family is enormous, and the chemistry underneath it is simple. Iron atoms bound to oxygen in different ratios, and crystal structures produce a spectrum that runs from pale yellow through deep orange and brick red to near black. The source material is iron ore, rusted iron, iron-rich soil, iron slag, and, crucially for this story, iron filings from grinding and machining operations that oxidize during or after processing. The quality of iron oxide pigment depends almost entirely on what is in the source material and how that material is processed. Commercial iron oxide pigment is produced synthetically in controlled chemical reactions. It is consistent, clean, and cheap, and it produces colors that are uniformly even. That evenness is both its advantage and its limitation. Natural iron oxide pigments, derived from actual iron-bearing earth or processed iron waste, contain trace mineral inclusions, varied crystal structures, and slight inconsistencies in particle size that produce colors with a quality that painters who work in oil or fresco describe as optical depth. The color shifts slightly as light changes. It does not flatten. The trade term for this quality is luminosity. The practical implication is that a tube of natural iron oxide pigment commands a price between 3 and 8 times that of its synthetic equivalent. The artist who wants a Venetian red that breathes in changing gallery light will pay it. Cass Hewitt had been working with natural sources for 30 years. He knew this. The Ironworks, which had been depositing filings at his gate since 2009, did not. The man who came to tell Cass the depositing would begin was named Dale Strick. He was 44 years old in 2009, and he held a degree in environmental management from Penn State and had spent the better part of 15 years working for companies that moved industrial byproducts from where they were made to where they could legally be placed. He was not a bad man. He was, in fact, efficient and thorough, and he had filed every piece of necessary paperwork correctly, which is exactly what a person in his position was supposed to do. He believed the iron filings were a nuisance that someone with land and patience could absorb. He believed Cass was that person because Cass had not protested. In Dale's professional model of the world, the absence of protest was consent, and consent was the end of the analysis. The first deposit came in June of 2009. A company flatbed pulled to the fence and offloaded roughly 2 tons of dark, gritty material, a mix of fine iron particles and oxidized scale from the grinding floor, into a heap at the gate. Cass walked out to look at it when the truck left. He crouched and picked up a handful. It was dense and cool, and the color was a complex reddish-brown, with a dark gray center where the oxidation had not reached. He rubbed some between his fingers. He went back inside and got the ledger, and looked at a formula his father had written in 1971 for a color called Monongahela Red. He did not call Dale Strick. He went to the shed and got a sieve and a bucket. If you think the story at this point is simply a story about a man who turned a problem into an opportunity, you are partly right, but you are missing the mechanism that made it possible. The mechanism is the sieve, and what comes after the sieve, and the 30 years Cass had spent learning how to use both. Iron filings from a machining operation are not pigment. They are metal particles with varying degrees of oxidation, mixed with cutting fluid residue, fine abrasives from the grinding wheels, and fragments of the work pieces themselves. The first thing Cass did with each deposit was a wash. He ran the material through a first-stage water rinse in a long trough he built from treated lumber, then a magnetic separation pass using a set of neodymium magnets in a frame his son helped him weld in the winter of 2010. The magnets pulled out the unoxidized metallic iron, which was not useful for pigment, and left behind the oxidized material and mineral inclusions. He dried the separated fraction on mesh screens under the shed roof, and then ran it through a sequence of hand-cranked ball mills, small ceramic-lined drums his father had acquired in the 1970s, grinding the dried material to progressively finer particle sizes. The final grinding stage, which Cass called the long mill, ran for 8 to 12 hours, depending on the batch. At the end of it, he had a fine, dry powder. He wetted a small amount with linseed oil on a glass plate and drew it out with a palette knife. The color that appeared was rarely the same shade twice, because the exact composition of the Ironworks filings changed with what they were machining in any given week. Sometimes the material ran warm and yellow, high in goethite, which is the iron hydroxide that makes natural yellow ochre. Sometimes it ran toward deeper red, high in hematite. Sometimes there were gray-blue undertones from magnetite inclusions. Cass began keeping a log in the ledger alongside his father's formulas, recording the deposit date, the rough color temperature of the raw material, the mill time, and the resulting color when drawn out in oil. By 2012, he had 11 distinct shades logged from Ironworks material alone. If Cass had been a different kind of person, he might have called Dale Strick in that first year to report what he had found. He might have proposed a formal arrangement. He did not, for the same reason a man who has grown something valuable in a field does not announce it at the moment the first shoot clears the soil. He was watching to see what it could become. The other thing he was doing, quietly and without calling attention to it, was testing the pigments. He had a loose network of painters and craftspeople he had supplied for years, people who understood what they were using in the way that working artists understand their materials, which is to say completely and without sentimentality. He began sending small samples with his regular orders, labeled only by number and the word experimental, asking for written responses on handling, color strength, and behavior in linseed and walnut oil carriers. The network was modest. It included a retired professor of fine arts at a college in Greensburg, a Pittsburgh oil painter who had been buying Cass's synthetic blends for 8 years, a furniture restorer in Morgantown who used tinted oil finishes on historical pieces, and a small group of conservation students who occasionally bought unusual materials for coursework. None of them were in contact with each other. None of them knew where the experimental samples came from. That was deliberate. Cass wanted the responses to be about the material, not the story of the material. The responses were not immediate, because painters take their time. By 2013, he had 12 written assessments in a folder on the kitchen table. 11 of them used some version of the word unusual. 7 used the word luminous. The retired professor in Greensburg had included 3 color chips painted on gessoed board and a handwritten note that said, "The depth of field in the number 4 shade, the warm amber orange he had been producing since 2010, was not something she had encountered in commercially sourced material. She asked if she could have more. He sent her another 100 grams with his next regular order and said nothing more about it. His neighbor to the east was a man named Gord Pauluk, who farmed 120 acres with a clean, documented operation, row crops, a small cattle lease, and a grain bin he rented to a cooperative. Gord was 53 in 2009, and he had been managing his land the way the county extension office recommended for years. He used commercial inputs, consulted yield maps, ran the numbers quarterly. He was on a first-name basis with the extension agent who covered the township, a young man named Brad who drove a clean White County pickup and held a master's degree in agricultural economics from Ohio State and was doing his best to help the farmers in his territory. Brad had told Gord in 2008 that the path to viability was scale, consolidation, and input efficiency, and Gord had found that advice reasonable because it matched everything else he heard at the cooperative meetings. His operation was clean and documented, and it produced a modest, steady return. When Cass mentioned one evening at Gord's kitchen table that the Ironworks had started depositing material on the fence line, Gord said that sounded like a headache. He said Cass should have called Dale Strick back and asked for a formal nuisance abatement. He said the county had a process for that. He said Brad had mentioned once that there were remediation funds available for agricultural land adjacent to industrial operations that could document a nuisance condition. He said Cass might qualify. Cass said he thought he would sit with it a while. Gord said he didn't know how Cass could stand the mess. Cass said it was not so much of a mess as it looked from the road. That was as far as the conversation went in 2009. It went further in 2015 when Gord drove over to see the processing shed. Cass had built and stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the ball mills and the drying screens and the rows of small glass jars filled with pigment powder in shades that ran from pale amber through copper and rust to deep burgundy. He asked what all of it was. Cass told him, in the same plain voice he used for everything. Gord said that was the damnedest thing he had ever heard, and he meant it as a compliment. And he also did not yet understand that what he was looking at had already become something. Cass's grandson, Marcus, was 23 in 2014, when he came back from 2 years at a business program in Pittsburgh. He had not finished the program, not because he had failed, but because he had looked at the curriculum midway through and decided that what it was actually teaching him was how to manage a system someone else had already built. He came back to the farm with strong opinions about markets and a healthy skepticism about almost everything else. When Cass told him about the pigment work, Marcus spent an afternoon in the shed and then said, with the confidence particular to young men who have recently studied commerce, that Cass was leaving an enormous amount of money on the table by not pricing to the institutional art supply market. Cass said he had been pricing to the people who actually used the material. Marcus said those two populations might not be as different as Cass thought. That was the beginning of the only real argument they had. And it was not a long one, because Cass said Marcus was welcome to try the market he believed in, and they would see what happened. Marcus spent 3 months that winter sending samples and pricing sheets to regional art supply distributors. Two of them were interested enough to request larger samples. One, a Pittsburgh firm that supplied university art departments and restoration studios, sent a buyer named Renata to the farm in February of 2015. She stood in the doorway of the shed the same way Gord had. She asked how the material was sourced. Cass explained the deposit arrangement with the Ironworks and the separation process in the mill. She picked up a jar of the shade Cass called Number 7, the deep copper red that consistently tested strongest among the painters. She held it to the shed's single overhead lamp. She was quiet for what felt like a full minute. She said, "Can I ask what you're charging per kilogram?" Cass told her. She said, "That's too low?" Renata was the qualified outside assessment that moved the work out of the category of eccentric local craft and into the category of commercial pigment. She placed an initial order for 6 kilograms across 3 shades and asked what the current production ceiling was. Cass said he was limited by processing time and the irregular deposit schedule from the Ironworks. She said if he could increase the consistency of supply, she believed she could move significantly more volume. She used the word significantly, which Marcus wrote down in the margin of the ledger that evening. Meanwhile, Dale Strick had continued delivering. The deposits came every 4 to 6 weeks, a ton or two at a time, and by 2016 the accumulated pile along the fence line had grown to nearly 15 tons. Dale drove out twice a year for what he called a courtesy check to confirm the material was being managed per the original agreement. He walked the fence line with a clipboard. He looked at the shed without asking what it was. He checked a box on his form and left. The Ironworks was happy. The material was going somewhere legal. The costs were contained. In the summer of 2016, a writer for a Pennsylvania crafts and trades journal drove out to interview Cass for a short piece on traditional pigment making. The piece ran in October of that year. It mentioned the Ironworks arrangement in one paragraph. Dale Strick did not read the journal. Marcus had by then built a simple website and given the operation its name. He had argued for several names, and Cass had rejected them all until Marcus suggested using the gate, which was where the material arrived. Cass said that was fine. The brand became Harmon Gate, after the township where the Ironworks stood. The domain cost $12. What the website did, which a single entry in a crafts journal could not, was create a searchable record that connected the pigment to its source story. Marcus had written the product copy carefully, because he had watched enough buyers respond to Renata's questions to understand that the source was the thing. Painters who worked in oil and fresco did not just want a red. They wanted a red with a provenance. The Harmon Gate sourcing story was exact, and Marcus had written it plainly. Iron material from a machining operation, separated and milled on the farm, no synthetic additions, batch variation logged and noted on each package. The variation, which a commercial supplier would have called a quality control problem, became in Marcus's framing a feature. Each batch had a slight character of its own. Buyers who ordered twice expected a slight difference. Several said that was the point. By 2017, the website was receiving small orders from painters in 7 states. Cass expanded the drying area under the shed roof and added a second ball mill that Marcus sourced from a ceramics supplier going out of business in West Virginia. The increased capacity moved annual production from roughly 30 kilograms to nearly 80 kilograms across all shades. The ledger Marcus kept alongside Cass's original was now its own separate document, a spiral-bound production log tracking batch numbers, deposit dates, mill runs, and sale destinations. Neither of them said much about what was happening. Cass said less than usual, which was saying something. Then, in the dry summer of 2018, the summer that broke Gord Pollock's field, Allegheny County and the surrounding region went into a drought that lasted through August. The rainfall deficit for the 3 months was more than 9 inches below the seasonal average. Row crops across the county failed at rates not seen since the early 1980s. Gord's corn came in at 41 bushels per acre against a county average that had run close to 150 in recent years. The soybeans were worse. He lost the lease income on the cattle rotation when the pasture burned off in July. By September, Gord was looking at a year-end loss that would require him to draw against a line of credit he had been trying to pay down since 2012. He was not alone. The cooperative that rented his grain bin had members who lost entire harvests. 3 farms in the township put equipment up for auction in November. The farm supply store in town had a run on crop insurance paperwork that the staff said was unlike anything since the regional flooding in 1988. Cass Hewitt's property did not have a row crop operation. His beef herd was small, 22 head, and he kept them on a rotationally managed pasture that had a good root structure and held moisture longer than Gord's conventionally grazed field. His market garden went short on tomatoes and sweet corn, but the root crops held. More to the point, his income that year did not depend on what the sky did or did not do between June and August. Dale Strick drove out in October of 2018 for his courtesy check. He stood at the gate, which now had 2 neatly maintained rows of accumulated material alongside it, and he looked at the shed and the extension Cass had built. He had driven this lane in June of 2016, when Cass's operation had a website but no external coverage, and he had looked at the shed then the same way he looked at it now, with the studied indifference of a man whose form required only that the material was on the property and managed. Not that he knew what managed meant. He had written in his check-in note that year that Cass appeared to be engaged in some kind of artisanal hobby use of the material, and the company's environmental compliance officer had said that was fine. He looked at what Cass was doing now, which was pulling finished jars from a drying rack and labeling them by hand. He asked what the jars were. Cass said paint pigment. Dale said from what? Cass said from the material you've been delivering. There was a long pause. Dale looked at the jars again. He looked at the label on one that Marcus had designed, a clean rectangle printed on a home printer with the Harmon gate name and the batch number. He said carefully that the Ironworks had not anticipated a secondary use of the material. He said the arrangement had been filed as a waste accommodation. He said he was not sure a hobby operation producing a commercial product under those terms was something the company's legal department would be comfortable with. That was the 3rd time in 9 years he had said some version of that word to Cass's face, hobby, and the 3rd time Cass had not answered it. The first had been in June of 2009 at the initial meeting, when Dale had said, by way of reassurance, that a farmer with a little arts and crafts interest might find some use for the grit. The second had been the 2016 check-in note, which Cass had been shown a copy of because the county waste coordinator had forwarded it as routine documentation. And now this, October of 2018, with the summer drought's damage still visible in the fields across the road. Cass said he was ready for that conversation whenever it needed to happen. Dale got in the pickup and drove back up the lane. He did not return in the spring of 2019. The deposits continued. The conversion had begun, though Dale did not know yet what it was converting him toward. What changed in 2019 was the art world's finding the operation directly, without going through a distributor. An architectural restoration firm in Philadelphia working on a 19th century industrial building, was trying to source pigment that matched the original interior reds, which a paint analysis had shown to be iron oxide, based with the kind of spectral signature that suggested natural rather than synthetic origin. The firm's materials sourcer had been through 4 synthetic suppliers whose reds read flat against a small surviving patch of original paint in a corner of the 3rd-floor corridor. A ceramics instructor at a Pittsburgh art school had mentioned Harmon Gate in an online forum. The materials sourcer called Marcus. Marcus shipped 4 sample pots. The materials sourcer called back the next day. She said that 2 of the 4 matched the spectral analysis within tolerances the firm was willing to accept. She said the project budget was approved for 22 kilograms of the matching shade for the full restoration. She said, and she said this slowly, "What is your current lead time?" Marcus looked at the production log. He looked at the drying rack. He said 6 weeks. She said, could he do 5? He said he would ask his grandfather. Cass said yes. The restoration contract came with a project specification sheet that named the pigment and its source. The specification sheet became part of the building's permanent restoration documentation, filed with the Philadelphia Historical Commission, alongside the paint analysis report and the restoration methodology. It was not a famous document. It was a routine filing of the kind that historical restoration projects produce by the pound. What made it useful was that it was searchable. The documentation was reviewed 18 months later by a materials conservation specialist at a university in Pittsburgh as part of an academic paper on regional sourcing in architectural restoration. She was making an argument in the paper that matching historical paint in restoration work required sourcing from materials with compatible mineral profiles, not simply from colorimetric charts, and she needed examples of suppliers who were working in natural pigments derived from regional geology. The Harmon Gate specification sheet was the clearest example she had found. The paper cited Harmon Gate by name in a footnote and noted that the pigment was derived from iron oxide material sourced from an industrial operation in western Pennsylvania and processed on a farm property in Allegheny County, which she described correctly as an unusual and apparently successful model. The footnote was read by a writer at a trade publication for fine art suppliers who had been looking for a story about the natural pigment revival that had some genuine industrial texture to it. He called Marcus in the summer of 2020. Marcus called Cass. Cass said he supposed someone from a publication could come out, and they did. The piece that ran in November of 2020 in a publication that went to independent art supply retailers and studio suppliers across the Mid-Atlantic and Great Lakes regions was 3 pages long and included a photograph of Cass's hands holding a jar of the deep copper-red No. 7 shade, and a short description of the sourcing arrangement with the Ironworks. The writer had asked Cass how he had decided to start processing the material. Cass had looked at him for a moment and said he had not decided exactly. He said he had noticed what the material was and then done the obvious thing. The writer had written that down. Dale Strick had a subscription to the trade publication. He read it on a Tuesday morning. He drove out on a Thursday. He sat at Cass's kitchen table with a coffee Marcus made and a copy of the article that he had folded and refolded until the crease lines ran through the photograph. He did not say very much for the first 5 minutes. He looked at the ledger Cass had set on the table, the original one from his father, open to a page of formulas from 1972. He looked at the newer production log next to it. He looked at the labeled jars lined up on the kitchen counter, 37 of them in various shades, waiting for a packed shipment. The article sat between them on the table. The piece had mentioned a figure in passing, the prior year's gross revenue from the pigment operation. Marcus had given the number to the writer because the writer had asked, and Marcus had seen no reason to withhold it. The number was not enormous. It was not a number that would have impressed anyone at the Ironworks as a line item. What it represented, which Dale was in the process of understanding, was that a material the Ironworks had been paying to transport and dispose of had been generating that number for years on the farm at the end of the lane, and nobody had told them. $34,000 in the prior calendar year, from material the Ironworks had been glad to be rid of. Dale set the coffee cup down. He did not pick it up again for a long while. He said he had not understood what he was delivering. Cass said it was not something he had advertised. Dale said that the Ironworks, if they had known the material had commercial value, would have had a conversation with Cass years ago about the terms of the arrangement. He said the depositing agreement had been framed as a waste disposal accommodation. He said there was a real question about whether Cass's use of the material constituted unauthorized commercial extraction of company property. Marcus, who was standing in the doorway, said that the arrangement had placed the material on Cass's property with no condition other than non-toxic disposal. Dale said he was not a lawyer. Cass said he knew a woman in Pittsburgh. The room was quiet. Through the kitchen window, the fence line was visible, and the near corner of the processing shed, and the pair of old ceramic mills on the bench under the shed's open wall. Dale looked at them for a moment. Dale sat with that for a moment. He said that was not what he had come to do. He said, and the way he said it was honest, he had come because he thought there might be an arrangement that worked for everyone. He said the Ironworks had a waste cost problem that Cass had solved, and the Ironworks also had, potentially, a material that Cass had made into something of real value, and he thought those two facts ought to produce a conversation rather than a dispute. Cass said that was the first reasonable thing Dale had said at his gate in 12 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus laughed, which broke it, and Dale eventually smiled, which was not his habitual expression, but suited him adequately. The formal supply agreement they reached that spring allowed Cass to continue processing all deposited material for pigment production in exchange for a small percentage of gross revenue above a baseline threshold. The Ironworks gained the ability to document the arrangement as a circular economy initiative for their annual sustainability report. Dale drove it out personally when it was signed, and he shook Cass's hand at the gate, and he looked at the fence line where the piles had been, which Cass had now processed, down to a working stock of about 8 tons, and he said something that surprised both of them. He said it was something. What a man could do with time and attention. Cass looked at the fence line, too. He said yes. By 2022, Harmon Gate had 12 named shades in regular production, all derived from the Ironworks material processed through the methods Cass had been refining since 2009. The year's gross revenue crossed $41,000, which was not large by the measure of businesses built on spreadsheets and investor rounds, but it was money made from a material that a company had been paying to get rid of. Under the formal supply agreement, Cass paid 3% of gross above a $15,000 annual baseline back to the Ironworks, which the Ironworks used to fund a small equipment recycling program they had been unable to budget otherwise. Dale had negotiated that detail himself and had seemed pleased with it. The market garden was still running. The herd was at 26 head. The ledger his father had kept was now shelved next to 2 newer logs Marcus maintained, and the 3 of them in sequence were the history of a thing that had grown so quietly. Nobody outside that farm had noticed it until it was already complete. That spring, Cass had received a letter from a paint conservation graduate student at Carnegie Mellon, who had read the trade publication piece and written asking if she could come observe the processing method for a research project. He had written back in longhand on the same paper he used for invoices and said she was welcome to come on a Saturday, when there was a mill run scheduled. She had come 3 Saturdays in a row and taken careful notes. He had shown her the magnetic separation step and the long mill and the way to read the oil draw on the glass plate. He had shown her the ledgers. She had sat at the kitchen table for an hour reading formulas from 1972. She had asked if she could cite the ledger in her thesis. Cass said she could cite anything she could see. Gord Pollock came by in the late summer of 2022 and sat on the porch with Cass and a glass of iced tea and said he had been thinking about diversifying. He said the drought of 2018 had taught him something he didn't know how to articulate, and he was still working it out. He said he didn't know what the equivalent of Cass's situation looked like for him, because he didn't have an Ironworks depositing anything at his gate. Cass said the Ironworks hadn't deposited anything useful. The Ironworks had deposited a problem. The useful thing had been the 30 years before it. Gord sat with that. He said he supposed that was right. Cass said it was the right way to see it, and also that if Gord wanted, Marcus could show him what the soil pH requirements looked like for starting a small market garden on the south-facing quarter of Gord's field, because that ground had good drainage and the valley light was better there than the county map showed. Gord said he might take him up on that. Marcus did show him the following March, and Gord put in 2 acres of market garden on the south field in 2023. It was small, and it was a start. 3 of the art supply retailers who carried Harmon Gate Pigment contacted Marcus in 2023 asking for a larger allocation. He went back to the production logs and calculated what a 3rd ball mill would allow. He and Cass talked it over for 2 evenings and decided on a modest expansion, enough to supply the existing accounts consistently and take 1 or 2 new accounts per year. They decided against scaling to a facility operation. The material was what it was because of where it came from and how it was processed. The character of each batch came from the Ironworks grinding floor, from the mineral composition of what they were machining, from the slow oxidation of the pile at the gate through Pennsylvania winters, from the specific ceramic media in those old mills, turning for 10 hours at a stretch. You could not move those things to a warehouse in a business park without losing the thing that made them worth moving. That was not sentiment. That was the mechanism. The ledger Cass's father had started in 1968 now had 3 successors on the shelf beside it. The 4th was the one Marcus had been keeping since 2014, and at the front of it, Marcus had written 1 line from a note Cass's father had left tucked into the original ledger's front cover, a sentence the old man had apparently written down from the fresco restorer, who taught him the craft. The color is already in the earth. Your job is to free it without ruining it. Cass had not mentioned that sentence when he handed Marcus the ledger. Marcus had found it on his own and written it down before Cass realized he had seen it. He asked Cass later what it meant exactly. Cass said it meant exactly what it said. What comes to mind, looking back at those 12 years from the road Cass walked from gate to shed to kitchen table and back again, is that 2 entirely different things were happening simultaneously on that fence line, and only one of them was visible. Of what Dale Strick saw every time he drove down that lane was a disposal problem being managed. What was actually accumulating was knowledge. Knowledge about this material from this source, processed by this method at this season, layered batch by batch into a ledger that no engineer's summary sheet could replicate. The Ironworks had the filings. Cass had the years. There is a way of knowing the world that requires a degree and a model and a projection, that asks what the numbers say about what a thing is worth, and answers in the currency the spreadsheet can count. And there is a way of knowing that requires a sieve and a ball mill and an old ledger and the willingness to crouch at a fence line in the early morning and rub a handful of gritty, reddish material between your fingers and recognize it for what it might become. Both of those ways of knowing are real, but they do not see the same things. The Ironworks filings are still coming down that lane. The gate is still there. Marcus parks the truck next to it when he comes out to help with a processing run, and Cass's granddaughter, who is 17 and does not say much but has started asking about the ball mills, parks her bicycle next to the truck. The ledger is still open on the kitchen table in the evenings, and the new entries go in beside the old ones in the same hand that has been making them for 38 years. The color was already in the earth. That part was always true.